Okay, folks, so our next speaker is Dr. Nicole Maher. She's a senior coastal scientist with the Nature Conservancy, and she's been doing a lot of work with looking at our salt marshes. So she's going to talk about assessing salt marsh health on Long Island, which is a huge issue because it's a very important ecosystem, and with sea level rise, this is a big question mark on how that's going to all pan out. So I'm really happy to have Nicole here.
Thanks, Mike, and nice to see you all. So, like Mike said, today I want to talk about salt marshes and salt marsh health because we all know that they're super valuable. So because they're so valuable, we want to make sure that they're healthy and functioning well today and functioning into the future. And we depend on salt marshes in more ways than we commonly recognize. They provide so many benefits to both nature and people. They fuel our coastal food webs. They provide habitat for wildlife. They cycle nutrients. They attenuate wave energy to provide risk reduction for storms. And so all of these benefits that they provide, in sum, help protect a healthy coastal ecosystem, and then all of the social and economic activities that depend on a healthy coastal ecosystem. So a simple recipe that I like to use for describing what salt marshes need to be healthy, this is a recipe you will not find on epicurious.com, has just 5 ingredients. Our salt marshes need a mobile sediment supply. They need clean water. They need room to move. They need a full tidal signal. These are intertidal habitats. The tide needs to come in, and the tide needs to go fully out. And this includes episodic storm events, too. This is what helps them be dynamic and respond to sea level rise and future storms. And of course, they need appreciation from us of their value so that we make decisions that support them. One of the first projects that I started at the Nature Conservancy was a salt marsh project to assess salt marsh health. I wanted to know if our salt marshes were healthy, specifically if they were keeping up with sea level rise. And so I set up a network of marsh elevation stations across Long Island with permanent monitoring stations to measure elevation changes here. And these stations have been important for diagnosing what's going on in individual marshes, but they've also been important regionally because the data collected at them has been input data for a lot of the marsh migration models that we see helping us make decisions about the future, the SLAM marsh migration models. And they're also part of a larger regional study helping us learn how our salt marshes respond to big storm events like Superstorm Sandy. The next map shows the marshes with these long-term monitoring stations that are being read primarily by the Nature Conservancy, but we've helped other partners install stations in additional marshes so that the network is much more extensive than this. But my colleague Adam Stark and I just finished analyzing our last 14 years of data from these marshes so that we could diagnose the different components of marsh elevation growth to figure out if our salt marshes were keeping pace with sea level rise, and if they weren't, to diagnose the reasons for those elevation shortfalls. And so much like monitoring a retirement bank account, knowing what the overall balance is and its trajectory is important. But if you really want to optimize that growth or that balance, it's better to have an accounting of the different withdrawals and deposits into that account. And so then you can optimize the performance of that account. And it's very similar for what Adam and I were doing in our salt marsh stations. We were measuring the overall elevation change of the marsh. We were measuring the change that was happening just at the very surface, above that white layer. It looks like frosting. It's actually a non-toxic ceramicous clay called feldspar. And so that layer was put down on what was the surface of the marsh 14 years ago. And so we can measure how the marsh grew just above that. And then we have another station that only goes down 0.5 meter, about just under 2 feet, to measure the growth of the salt marsh that's happening in the actively growing root zone. So the big takeaway messages are salt marshes right now are not keeping pace with recent rates of sea level rise. And And the missing component is in that actively growing root zone. It's not in the super deep area. It's not in the strata of marsh right on the surface. It's in that actively growing root zone. This is a cartoon that shows how our different measurements were collected and how we basically used algebra to figure out, with the overlapping measurements, which were the parts that were missing growth. I'm looking to show you the potential reasons for this missing growth component. Here we go. The potential reasons that we're missing growth in this actively growing root zone could be because our marshes are at a suboptimal elevation for vigorous vegetation growth. There's sort of a peak when it gets just enough flooding and just enough draining, but it also could be because the peat is waterlogged from past manipulations in these salt marshes, so that the tide's not always coming in all the way, or more importantly, it's not always going out when the tide goes out. It could also be from excessive nutrient loading, changing the way the plants grow, changing the way organic matter is stored in this actively growing root zone. Or it could simply be from increased temperatures, increasing the rate of decomposition of that organic matter that we want to be stored and sequestered in this area. But using this information now, we can design conservation and restoration projects to test or address these possible threats. And I will describe two of these projects that are underway to address these threats in our salt marshes. But first, I want to ask you a question. How many of you remember what you were taught in school for the number of basic tastes that our tongues can taste? Can you raise your hand and give me a number? Okay, so when I was in school, I remember learning there was 4, and then there was the new one, 5, and now I think people who study this say there could be 14, 15 different flavors that we detect. So the message that I want to share here is sometimes we only see what we expect to see. This is a painting from the late 1800s of salt marsh farming in Newbury, Massachusetts. We coastal ecologists didn't appreciate that there was farming and manipulation of the way water moved in our marshes. Starting as early as the 1600s and 1700s and 1800s, farmers were building berms and digging dikes and building embankments so that they could optimize the way water flew into and out of the salt marshes to optimize the production of salt hay and even products for livestock and human consumption. Oops. So we weren't taught about that in our coastal ecology textbooks, but it was written about in farming journals, and even art historians, looking at paintings from the 1800s, even art historians probably knew more about this farming history in our salt marshes than we coastal ecologists did. And this farming happened on Long Island too. Colleagues Becca Cusa and Adam Stark did some digging in historical records and found both text and photographs of evidence of farming happening on Long Island salt marshes. This photograph is from 1899, and look at how heavy that barge looks. That is salt hay being unloaded at a dock in Patchogue in 1899. And this is a series of photographs taken by artist Frederick Cost in 1906 of activities of salt hay farming on Long Island. And the man depicted in this photograph, the man photographed here is Wallace Sweezy, harvesting salt hay on the Carmans River here in Brookhaven. He was an ice dealer, and so he was probably using this salt hay as insulation. So now that we know about this farming history and the manipulations that were made in our marshes to optimize production of salt hay and other products, we see the signs of this, and sometimes they're more subtle than others wherever we look. And I'm working with a fantastic group of innovative salt marsh researchers and restoration practitioners who have really brought the appreciation of this farming history into the conversation of current salt marsh restoration practitioners and managers, so that we can understand what might be causing issues that we're seeing in our salt marshes, and then design a light touch, minimally invasive restoration to address those issues. What's happening now is that because sea level rise is accelerating, water is not, the salt marshes that have some of these historic farming structures in them are not able to allow the tide to come fully in and to go fully out. And so it's impacting the way that the marshes are growing, it's impacting the way they're trapping sediment, and impacting their ability to migrate landward. You can see in this picture, a group of us are standing in a straight line. It happens to be, that's the higher and drier spot. That's an old farming embankment that had sort of cut this marsh up into parcels. And they're more subtle. You can see that rectangle of marsh in front of the larger group of people, that as the tide is going out, the water is not leaving that section of marsh. And so it's essentially suffocating or waterlogging those plants, and the peat is collapsing. And as the peat collapses, it releases its nutrients like nitrogen, and that can fuel an algal bloom, an algal mat that can form and then move around on that pan, sort of expand and expand and expand these unvegetated sections of marsh. And so the more we look, the more we see these. If you can see the lighter color grasses here that are at a 90-degree angle, that's sort of the remnants of an old agricultural embankment there that is trapping water on its backside and stunting the marsh grasses that are growing on the inside of that embankment. And so we can use this information to design minimally invasive restoration techniques to work with the way water needs to flow in and out of those marshes so that the marsh peat can grow at its root zones. And we want to do holistic marsh restoration for all of the functions that it provides. And one of the characteristic species of the salt marsh that depends on our success is the Saltmarsh Sparrow. And these little songbirds are incredible marsh specialists. They live their entire lives in the salt marsh. They're endemic to the east coast of the U.S. They breed in our salt marshes in the northeast. They overwinter in our salt marshes in the southeast. They actually cue in on the species of grasses in the high marsh to predict where the flooding frequency is sufficient so that they can expect to have a 23-day window where the nests that they build just above the surface of the marsh in the intertidal zone will have 23 days so that without flooding too much, so that they can successfully lay their clutch of eggs and hatch them. And these species have got fantastic adaptations to help them do this. So more often than not, the first clutch of eggs that a female bird lays in the spring will be flooded out. But then it's sort of like it's starting her clock again. So she'll lay another clutch of eggs, hoping that that's the highest high tide of the month, and she'll have 23 days before the next highest tide comes in. But the chicks and the eggs are, the species has evolved so that the eggs can even get flooded. And they can be flooded for an hour or two. The pores on the eggshell are not like the pores on my backyard chicken's eggs at home. They can survive that. So as long as the tide doesn't rise so much that it pushes the eggs out of the nest, that when the tide goes out, the mother bird will come back and warm them up. And even at 6 days old, the chicks can actually climb up on the grasses. Even if they haven't fledged yet, they can climb up out of the grasses for a couple hours when the tide comes in, and then go back into the nest after. If we've got a little time, I've got some great videos that were shared with me by Dr. Sam Apgar, who is a fisheries, a wildlife biologist with Fish and Wildlife, who studied these Saltmarsh sparrows in her dissertation. The survival of this species is dependent on the persistence of high marsh and high marsh habitat that experiences 23-day periods without having too much flooding. And so without intervention, our climate models now project that by mid-century, we're not going to have enough high marsh habitat that has that 23-day window between highest flooding. So we need to be considering this when we're thinking about marsh restoration for holistic marsh persistence, but then all of the obligate salt marsh nesting birds that depend on that high marsh habitat as well. The second effort that I want to talk about today also addresses one of the potential threats preventing the root zone from growing and contributing to elevation gain to help marshes keep pace with sea level rise. And most of us here on Long Island are familiar with the infamous Bay Park sewage treatment plant that empties into Western Hempstead Bay here, just to the east of Jamaica Bay. We knew that the plant that serves over 500,000 people, emptying into a bay with a residence time of up to 2 weeks, filled with marsh islands and then surrounded by low-lying, densely settled communities, was a problem before Superstorm Sandy blew through. But the superstorm really identified the severity of the problem. And fortunately, we have now made decisions to invest billions of dollars to improve the nitrogen removal at those sewage treatment plants in that area and connect them to an ocean outfall. And this is an opportunity to test. If we give these marsh islands the clean water that they need, how do they respond? So I'm going to back up a bit. Well, there we go. Just to say that the chronic excessive nutrient loading can impact the integrity of marsh peat and the delivery of the ecosystem services that we value from that marsh and their long-term viability, because chronic nutrient enrichment or eutrophication can contribute to marsh loss if it changes the way that the plants grow by growing more flimsy above-ground grass blades than dense network of roots below ground. And it also changes the storage of organic matter in that peat layer and impacting the integrity of the peat, because the elevated nutrients are like fertilizer for the bacteria to decompose that organic matter that we would rather have stored and sequestered. And so these resulting changes in peat instability can result in both loss of marsh elevation and loss of marsh extent. And we've been seeing these changes in Western Hempstead Bay. So in anticipation of this long overdue water quality restoration project, we conducted an extensive sampling. I'm trying to advance to, there we go, of 2 marsh islands within Western Hempstead Bay, but also another marsh in Western Long Island Sound that it also has high nutrient loads but does not anticipate a dramatic change in nutrient concentrations, and a low nutrient control, a marsh out in Peconic Bay at the Nature Conservancy's Mashomack Preserve, where it's a lower nutrient concentrations, and we don't expect that to change much in a number of years. So we took cores of the marsh peat, and we were able to run them through a hospital CAT scan to get an image, a 3-dimensional image of what the below ground root structure looked like. And when this is much faster than any of you have ever processed sediment samples. You know how dirty and time consuming it is to dissect a core, to sieve those pieces of mud through sieves, to pick apart the different components that you want to characterize, to dry them, to weigh them, and then to mathematically reconstruct your core by putting those numbers back together. This is a relatively fast and easy method to run the cores through the hospital CAT scan to get a 3-dimensional image. The green lines that you see are roots and rhizomes, and in yellow you see shell and sand fragments. We also took measurements of how sticky the marsh peat was, took samples to measure nutrient concentrations and carbon concentrations in the grass blades, the roots, the peat, and a number of other measurements. And we plan to repeat this sampling after the Bay Park Conveyance Project is complete sometime next year in 2024. And there's a fantastic website tracking the rationale for that project and also the progress of that project. So this is what some of those CAT-scan cores look like. They're three-dimensional images, and I find them really fun to look at. Again, on the left, they're roots and rhizomes, and on the right, it's the very same core, but you're looking at the densities of material that represent peat and sand. If you look carefully, you can see some green roots and rhizomes behind there. But in addition to the beautiful images, we've got a lot of data in these three-dimensional cores. And this plot here, you can see the changes in densities of roots and rhizomes and sand and shell as you go from the surface down through the core. And out of curiosity, I'll point out there are two peaks in sand, down one at 35 centimeters deep and another at 45 centimeters deep. And these are probably of the ages where we expect that the 35 centimeter peak was from the Long Island Express, the hurricane in 1938, and the peak at 45 centimeters is probably during the construction of the Reynolds Channel. So there, a group of saltmarsh researchers have recently characterized the relationship between nitrogen loading and saltmarsh stability and response in a really memorable and illustrative way. They liken it to the Gordian knot, because the mythical Gordian knot, because the relationship is not entirely straightforward. It can't be generalized simply into simply net positive response of saltmarsh stability or plant growth to nitrogen loading, or simply negative effects. And so because there are complex interactions among the environmental variables. So the myth of the Gordian knot is that there was once a complicated knot tied in what is now current-day Turkey, and the myth was that whoever could untie that knot was destined to rule all of Asia. And so in 333 BC, Alexander the Great was presented with the opportunity to try to untie the knot. And he took out his sword and he sliced it. And so the Gordian knot's become a metaphor for thinking outside the box to solve intractable problems. So we need to figure out these intractable problems because it matters to nature and people. And I got the 5-minute warning. What I would like to do is show you some videos from Dr. Sam Apgar, who's a wildlife biologist at Fish and Wildlife who studied Saltmarsh sparrows. This is a nest. You can sped up time. You can see the tide comes in. These 4 eggs rise with the tide. The tide doesn't push them out of the nest. And within 5 minutes after the water going out of the nest, mommy bird comes back, warms them up, and all 4 of these birds survive. This is in real time. These chicks are 6 to 7 days old, and they can't fly yet. But you can see as the water's rising, they're climbing up the grass blades there. And these guys also make it. And finally, 8 to 9 day old birds in a nest. You can see they've got more feathers now. They are able to better climb. They're more skilled than the other birds were at 6 to 7 days. And you can see them get out of the water here. So thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions at time. Well, now that we know what to pay attention to. So the question was, what's the verdict? Are we going to win or lose? And my answer is, now that we know that we need to focus on optimizing conditions for root zone growth and accumulation and storage of organic matter to contribute to elevation, and now that we know that we are dealing with systems that have been manipulated since the 1600s, and with an appreciation of how those systems have been manipulated, we can design a light touch restoration so to optimize, to remove that waterlogging and optimize that growth in that root zone in our salt marshes. So it's good to have this information so that we can work with it. Yes?
I would like to know, are there any other birds that are able to adapt like this, or is this very unique to this one species?
So that's a great question you're asking about. So these birds that have already adapted a lot to be able to nest and fledge chicks in the intertidal zone. In New York City, there was just a paper published where these birds, a population of these birds, are starting to learn to build their nests a little bit higher up. And so it'll be interesting to see if that catches on. And there are also other experiments, I'm happy to follow up with you afterwards, where people are trying to figure out if floating islands of salt marsh work, but they don't flood the same way, so they don't work. But they're very thoughtful people thinking about this problem, those who are focused specifically on the obligate salt marsh nesting birds.
Thank you.
Thanks.
If you have any questions, please go to the mic over here to the online speaker.
In the 70s and 80s, we used to sell and bring in salt hay for the horticultural industry. And by the 80s, there was only one person left, Jim Monroe, who brought, not from Long Island, because they couldn't harvest it on Long Island anymore, they brought it in from New Jersey. But then eventually, with the tide going up the way that it did, the marshes could not sustain the machinery to harvest the salt hay. So hence, there is no salt hay available. It's great hay to use because it lasts so much longer than regular straw. So my question is, do you anticipate being able to keep up with the continual rise of the tide to increase the stability of the root zone to then be able to put the machinery out there to actually harvest the salt hay?
So the question, so a great history of machinery, the salt marshes being firm enough to support machinery and growing enough salt hay that there were lots of folks out there harvesting it. I don't know that we're ever going to get back to that scale of high marsh salt hay, but some of that back in the day was the result of the manipulations that were made, these dikes and embankments that were made to optimize conditions for the growth of salt hay. What we do know is that marshes need to be able to grow in place, but almost more importantly, they need to be able to migrate landward, because we're not going to be able to maintain our salt marshes in place now as sea level rises. They need places to move landward, and that higher marsh habitat will migrate into what is sort of coastal dry land today.
Okay, so we'll have to move on to the next.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. That was great. Great.